for the Lord, and just we wanted to take that opportunity to exhort ourselves to do likewise, to demonstrate a magnificent zeal for the Lord and the things of the Lord, and understanding what that looks like in a New Testament context, and what we ought to be doing. Now we're in Numbers 21, and I know chronologically we've gone backwards, but it was an intentional bridge to the larger studies. We're going to get to Jonah. I can't frankly go immediately from Psalms to Jonah because I know it's only 4 chapters, but I have I don't like that most evangelical context, if you say Jonah, it's like, yeah, that's the guy that got knocked off the boat, he didn't want to go, and that's the end of the story. I think it's a magnificent book, and I want to give it proper attention. There's some things about it that will demand that we think through things. This is a prophet, and I'll allude to this later, we'll talk about it later, but you have other contexts where you have a prophet that the Lord says, you go this way, and go speak my message, and when you return, don't go that same way again. Simple enough, right? Take this route, take another route back. That prophet delivers his message and knows not to go back. He's not going back, and then another man of God or prophet-like figure says, go back that way. That's what the Lord told me to tell you. Well, I'm not supposed to. Well, that's what the Lord told me. And so he does, and what happens? He dies. Then you have Jonah, who's fleeing from the presence of the Lord. And his disposition is rather terrible. And why was he running? Well, the book's going to unpack it for us, but he knew the character of God, and he didn't want the Lord to have mercy and compassion and be slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love. He didn't want that for Nineveh, so he fled. There's things that you have to think through also in terms of the Lord relenting or changing his mind. There's some terrible theology out there that, as though you could manipulate the will and intentions of God. And Jonah puts it squarely with, did the Lord change his mind? What about, then you have to think back on when Moses was petitioning for the people of Israel, and the Lord said, I want to wipe them all out, and I'll start over with you, Moses. And Moses is saying, Lord, if you do that, it's your great name and your reputation that the nations will say, he took them out of Egypt, but he couldn't get them to the promised land. And the Lord relents. Is that a changing of the mind? No, I think there's more to it. We need to think through that. So Jonah, that's coming up. It just takes work to do it. So that being said, what do we do in the intermediate? We go to the Numbers, because nobody goes to Numbers, and that's a personal sadness of my part. So I want us to be well versed in the Scriptures. And so when we go to this passage, I want to accomplish 3 different goals. We'll be here this week and next week. First, I want us to give proper attention to the Lord leading and caring for his covenant people in a time of temporal judgment before championing their great victories and the securing of the land promised to the patriarchs. I'll say it one more time. Give proper attention to the Lord leading and caring for his covenant people in a time of temporal judgment before championing their great victories and the securing of the land promised to the patriarchs. Now, according to Denise here, I have a propensity to make dense statements. And it's not dense in the sense of ignorant, I hope. But just, it sits heavy, it doesn't quickly, it's not conducive to say quickly and then move along. So for fairness, what am I trying to communicate here? Does anybody tracking, what am I trying to communicate here? Thinking through the book of Numbers, thinking through what happened in Numbers 14, thinking through what happened in the book of Exodus. What's going on here?
You have the wilderness generation being wiped out so that their children can enter the promised land. But even during that time of judgment, God hasn't stopped leading his people. God hasn't stopped caring for them. He's still there. Yes.
So you have the magnificent, unparalleled deliverance out of Egypt. And I know, again, and I may be speaking too generically, and I don't want to be unfair by saying that, but a lot of times the Exodus account is, we will remember the 10 plagues and the splitting of the Red Sea, and that was really neat, and then they complained a lot, and then they went in and Joshua won combat. But you look at the Exodus account, and the Lord's hardening Pharaoh's heart. The Lord's working his will out. He's heard the cries of his people. And then you watch. You're good Old Testament students, right? So you watch all throughout the Old Testament. And what does the Lord refer back to? You remember what I did to Egypt? Remember what I did? How I made my name great? You want to know what was going on in Egypt? There was two things. One, when God made a covenant promise, an unbreakable promise to Abraham, in that splitting of the animals in half and him passing through, unilaterally making that covenant, there was a rather distressing element to him, because he said, Abraham, and this is part of the covenant that typically gets overlooked, your people will be in bondage for 400 years. That was part of what the Lord said was going to happen. So, yes, blessing of nation, blessing of the blessing of nation, multitude of people, blessing of land, and blessing of being a blessing, and having the preservation of the Lord. But 400 years of judgment. And why was all that? It was all setting it up for, one, the iniquity of the Amorites wasn't complete yet, but it was to make much of the great name of the Lord. He did that to make much of himself. And we've talked about how when you get to the precipice of the battles in the Promised Land, how the people of Jericho, their hearts were melted because they heard about the testimony from 40 years before that the Lord shamed and destroyed the people of Egypt. So, what do we want to accomplish? What I'm going through here with Numbers 21, I want to give attention to the fact that the Lord who delivered, the Lord who cared for them, he demonstrated consistent faithfulness. Yes, a generation will have to die out. That was part of their judgment. But even under that general judgment of that prior generation for their unbelief in Numbers 14, when they're at Kadesh Barnea and they won't go in because they didn't believe the Lord who magnificently delivered them from Egypt could actually deliver them to their promised land. I also want you to observe the revelations and demonstrations of God's character and his power. He's continuing to demonstrate his character and his power through how he interacts with the people. And very importantly, I'm mindful that Paul kind of nudges us to look at them as an example. And so I want you to confront your own appetite for demonstrations, and my own appetite as well, for demonstrations of weakness and failure. They're not unique, okay? We're not special because we have electronics and they didn't. They had hearts that needed to be regenerated, and they needed to grow in grace and to progress in their faith of the Lord. And we need to examine their appetite, but our appetite for demonstrations of weakness and failure. Second goal, giving attention to the principles that can be reasonably extrapolated from the larger context and precise content of Numbers 21, 4-9, helps us think through the elements of the major historical event that we're especially commemorating this year, the 500th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation. So again, giving attention to the principles that can reasonably extrapolated from the larger context and precise content of Numbers 21, 4-9, helps us think through the elements of the major historical event that we're specifically commemorating this year, the 500th year of the Protestant Reformation. Now, again, that was a major thrust of the conference, right? That's why we went quite large this year, and that's why the speakers were giving such magnificent emphasis on that. And I'm not looking for a text to defend the Reformation. I don't think that's even necessary, but I think it's also been done better than I could anyway. What I am doing is I want to draw your attention to principles that need to be thought about when we reflect on the Reformation. I think we need to reflect carefully on things, not just celebrate with corporate momentum, that yes, we're excited. We need to also think through different elements of it. And as Pastor Josh and several others have done a good job, for the reasons for the Reformation, that it had to happen. There's certain things, I was talking to a dear friend last night, that there's a context where and things are going to inevitably come to a head at some point in time in a situation that he's in. And this was, inevitably, something was going to happen. For the integrity of the Scriptures, the preservation of the church, it was inevitable. But we still need to think carefully about the subject of, one, opposing spiritual leadership. Now, we have the advantage of 500 years of reflection, but they had to operate in the moment, right? And they opposed, for all practical purposes, what was identified, at least by what you could identify, those were God's men, right? They were the leaders of the church. And I don't think we need to be cavalier about just saying, we look back and yes, it had to happen. Boy, that was a magnificently very large decision that had to be made, very heavy and weighty. So we need to think through when and if and how this is proper, when and if and how this is even acceptable. That's no small matter. And Numbers 21 is going to press us there, because we're going to see the leadership wasn't just opposed. When you opposed Moses, who else were you opposing? Yeah, you were opposing the Lord. And so you need to be thinking through these things. Also, I want you to think about the reality of making good memorials into idols, which is another trademark act of the Roman Catholic Church. I remember when I went to the church that's in Bethlehem over in Israel, and I walked in, it was like a costume jewelry store that just vomited all over the place. It was so gaudy and outrageous and silly. And I felt really bad. I insulted a lot of people, and I didn't start open air preaching. I didn't start like pointing and laughing. I went to they have like a little basement area, and they had this hole in the ground with this metal casing around it and whatever. You can look down in it about 10, 15 feet, and it's supposedly the spot where Jesus was born. And so I walked in, and the room was fairly empty, and I just walk, and I'm looking down, and I'm like, that's pretty neat. Probably took a picture, and then I turn around, and then I realized there's a whole wall of people like waiting in line to like have this special moment at like the birth site. And I thought, well, we know Bethlehem, yes, we're good with that, but that spot, and do you honestly think our Lord wanted us to take special trips to say, that's the spot right there? Or do you think the emphasis is on the fact that God Almighty was incarnate? I don't recall any time that Jesus took field trips with the apostles back to, hey guys, I want to show you where I grew up, and that's the spot I was born. It's silly. And Numbers 21 has a magnificent element of deliverance that, unfortunately, you'll see in, I believe, 2 Kings 18, became a point of idolatry. So things to be thinking about. Finally, the third goal is to give attention to a more complete understanding of Jesus' very consequential reference to this narrative when discussing the hope of Israel with one of its chief teachers, namely Nicodemus. So again, to give a more complete understanding of Jesus' very consequential reference to this narrative when discussing the hope of Israel with one of its chief teachers, namely Nicodemus. Remember John chapter 3? What is Nicodemus? Jesus says to him, what? If you want to see the kingdom of heaven, you must what? Born again. And does it confuse Nicodemus? Yes. Should it have?
No.
That rebuke he gives Nicodemus, you're the teacher of Israel and you don't understand these things. That's terrifying. That's the fear I keep in myself and I try to put in all of our teachers here. That, Lord forbid, that rebuke ever come to us. You're a teacher of the Scriptures and you don't understand these things. That which should have been understood, that which was plain from the book of Ezekiel, that which was plain throughout the Scriptures. And then when he's talking to Nicodemus and he's explaining, look, this is how it's going to happen. Just as Moses did what? Raised up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up. My goal is so that you, when you read John chapter 3, what I'm really going after is for you to be biblically informed, and that when you read Nicodemus' interaction, and he says, just as Moses raised the serpent in the wilderness, I know exactly what he's talking about. Numbers 21, they were coming from Mount Hor, going down to the Red Sea around Edom because they had to, because they can't go through Edom. You can't touch Edom. That's Esau's family, and there's a measure of protection and respect that's going to go with that. And the people grumbled, and the Lord sent fiery serpents because they grumbled against Moses and the Lord, and he raised up the serpent. All that's rushing through Nicodemus' mind. And he sees that serpent. He knows that serpent that was raised up in God's deliverance through raising up a serpent, or an image that would be looked upon. So I want you to think about those things. I want you to ever read the New Testament and be like, well, that's a neat picture, whatever it's talking about. Now, we can be Bible students, and good, robust Bible students. So let's begin our work in the text. It's a little small, but it's also in your copy of the Scripture, so you can follow along. Numbers 21, 4-9. Numbers 21, 4-9, and then we'll do some more foundational work. But it begins, from Mount Hor they set out by way to the Red Sea, to go around the land of Edom, and the people became impatient on the way. And the people spoke against God and against Moses. Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? For there is no food and no water, and we loathe this worthless food. Then the Lord sent fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people, so that many people of Israel died. And the people came to Moses and said, "We have sinned, for we have spoken against the Lord and against you. Pray to the Lord that he may take away the serpents from us." So Moses prayed for the people, and the Lord said to Moses, "Make a fiery serpent and set it on a pole, and everyone who is bitten, when he sees it, shall live." So Moses made a bronze serpent and set it on a pole, and if a serpent bit anyone, he would look at the bronze serpent and live. Now, just a warning. My goal for today, and I'm going to have to move to get there, is to get through verse 1. Because once you establish that foundation, you can move along. But what are we looking at? What are we heading toward? Well, just a couple of things I want to highlight. We're going to go over the geography for a few minutes because that does matter. But the land of Edom, you should remember from Numbers 25, we talked about some of this where Jacob and Esau, remember, two brothers, the covenant line's going to go through Jacob, but Esau was given a measure of blessing and a measure of preservation. So Moses is told, when Edom says, "You're not going to come through our land, and if you do, we're going to go into combat with you," Moses is told, "You're not going to fight Edom. You're not going to do that. You're going to have to go around them." So that's part of our context. We're going to talk about grumbling. And again, why have you brought us out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? How magnificently and disgustingly foolish of a phrase that is. The Lord who spoke creation, who shamed the most powerful nation for his own great name's sake. You're going to say, "Well, he did all that because he just wants us to die out here instead." How bizarre. But again, examine your own hearts. We are shockingly silly in our complaining. The Lord sends fiery serpents. They're biting the people. We'll get there next week. But isn't it interesting that in terms of the Lord, how he chose to interact and how he chose to resolve this, the serpents didn't go away. They're still biting people. The preservation is when you get bit, if you get bit, look and you'll be delivered. So there's a bit of a residual effect to these things. But let's go ahead and we'll jump in here. It's just a fascinating passage, though, even on its face value. But we're not going to be able to unpack every nuance and detail. I tried to do that in your study guides. And if you're your guest, this is one of my small satisfactions in life as I write study guides for our Sunday school classes. And I can get you a copy if you're just really wanting to delve into Numbers 21 with us, even from afar. But I want to go over the context of location first. And it's important. And I mentioned having gone to Bethlehem, and I had the privilege to study in Israel for 3 weeks back in 2000. And it was one of the most magnificent experiences, not just like the experiential side of like, oh, this is where, when you might sing the Via Dolorosa. Well, I've walked down the Via Dolorosa. Or you might say, well, Golgotha looks like this. Well, yeah, it actually kind of does. I saw that when I was walking on the old city walls. And those things are really fascinating. But the course that I was taking was the historical and biblical geography of Israel. And it put into my heart and my mind the value of geography, because when an Israelite reads this, they know exactly, like we were talking about where in Texas and where Colorado, and the fact that we even know Mississippi, Colorado, Texas, where these places are, we can peg them, right? And we can say that, the weather here, yeah, it's warm versus Colorado. We know what we're talking about, right? Well, the Israelites would have understood. So I want to bring us up to speed a little bit, because I do think it's valuable, and I think it's necessary to understand the context. When it says they went this way and then they started to grumble, they became impatient. Well, let's start to understand that a little bit, because location is important. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep these maps up here while I go over several verses that I'll put up, that I'll have here in the study guide. But first I want to show you where some of these locations are. So the wilderness of Paran. Here's when you hear Sinai Peninsula, you heard that, right? Well, it's right there. That's why. So this is big view, small view. So wilderness of Paran. And this, again, this is Israel, your promised land. A little bit closer shot. So wilderness of Paran. Hebron. It's going to reference Hebron. Kadesh Barnea. Very, very important. And they just continue to get highlighted as we go. The King's Highway. You should remember that from last week with Numbers 25. That was the route that Israel would have desired to have taken. It would have gone through Edom, through Moab, and expedited a trip. They can't go into Edom because Edom won't let them. Moab doesn't want to let them, but Moab doesn't have a choice. So, Hormah, it's speculated that's where it would be located. Mount Hor, which is, again, that brings us to our immediate passage. So, when it says that they went from Mount Hor down to the Red Sea and around Edom, you can see where they've been, in general at least, and now you can see their route. So the whole substantial times occurring on the west side here, they're going to go back down and around, and that might help a little bit of the picture of what we have going on here. Now, keep that up there, keep your eyes and attention there, and I'll go over some of these context of location. Numbers 12:16. And the people set out from Hazareth and came into the wilderness of Paran. Numbers 13. So Moses sent them from the wilderness of Paran according to the command of the Lord, all of the men who were heads of the people of Israel. Again, Numbers 13:22 now. They went up into the Negev and came to Hebron. So you can see where they're going up into. Numbers 13:26. And they came in Moses and Aaron, and they came to Moses and Aaron to all the congregation of the people in the wilderness of Paran at Kadesh, and it'd be Kadesh Barnea. So right there. Now, since the Amalekites and the Canaanites dwell in the valleys, turn tomorrow and set out for the wilderness. So 13 is pre-rebellion, right? 14, we can't go in, they're big, we're grasshoppers. No, the Lord will deliver you. Well, no, we can't. Anger of the Lord, Joshua and Caleb will go with this or with the next generation. This generation will die. Oh boy, we messed up. We're going to go in. The Lord's on our side. Moses and the ark doesn't accompany them. They get, a few of them get taken care of. The wilderness wandering begins. So Numbers 14. Now since the Amalekites and the Canaanites dwell in the valleys, turn tomorrow and set out for the wilderness by the way of the Red Sea. So you can see why the trajectory is going to start heading down this way. And a measure of, can you imagine, in as much as we can, being on the precipice of taking the promised land, an unbelievably foolish rebellion, and now you're just skirting around it. You can imagine that's got to wear on you. But this is a judgment on that generation. They will die out. So here they're traveling. Numbers 20, verse 1, and the people of Israel, the whole congregation, came into the wilderness of Zin in the first month, and the people stayed in Kadesh. And Miriam died there and was buried there. Numbers 20:14, Moses sent messengers from Kadesh to the king of Edom. So, hey, can we pass through your land? No, it's not going to happen. Numbers 20:21-22. Thus Edom refused to give Israel passage through his territory, so Israel turned away from him, and they journeyed from Kadesh, and the people of Israel and the whole congregation came to Mount Hor. So that's putting us right where we are for today. 21:3. And the Lord heeded the voice of Israel and came and gave over the Canaanites, and they devoted them and their cities to destruction. So the name of that place was called Hormah. Now what happened with that situation was some of the Canaanites there came in and apparently made a raid on Israel, took some of their people, and what does Israel do? They pray, Lord, if you'll deliver us, if you'll give us victory over these people, we vow that we will make good on destroying their city, absolutely, completely destroy it. And what happens? Well, Israel completely destroys their city. They make good on their vow, and they called that place Hormah. So that's kind of Numbers 21, 1, 2, and 3. So how does it set us up? They've been wandering. We understand their path a little bit. We know that our passage is going to start from Mount Hor, going down to the Red Sea, around Edom. And just before this, they had been given a supernatural military victory. Okay, so they should be tracking along really well. Really well. So let's give attention now to our passage proper. The Israelites went from groaning for deliverance to a pattern of grumbling for servitude and treats. The people of Israel were groaning for the Lord's deliverance from the tyrannical wickedness of Egypt. And when their deliverance was secured by the Lord, who remembered his covenant promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they soon began to grumble and fear and then in ingratitude. Now, when I said they start off with groaning, this is Exodus 2:24. 400 years of servitude. And God heard their groaning. And God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and Jacob. If the Lord makes a promise, is he going to keep his promise? Absolutely. And isn't that magnificent that this is how we're starting off on such a wonderful foot here with Exodus 2, because they went down to 70, basically a clan that consisted of, it started off with women that were unable to have children, and then the Lord's kindness, there were children born, and then more children born, and then you have that we talked about a couple of weeks ago. Rachel and Leah built the house of Israel, and you have these 4 ladies and 12 children, and what a bizarre story some of that can be. And the Lord was pleased to use that, and he takes them down there, and he puts them in an incubator to grow into a nation. They're put into servitude, and then what do? They groan to the Lord, and he remembered. Yeah, I made a promise, and this is part of the element of promise, and he delivers his people. And this is how the Exodus account's set up. He heard their groaning. But they so quickly went from groaning to grumbling. And they've now become known for this. How many of you know Israel in this season as the grumbling people? I mean, isn't that horrible? Like, we identify generations like Generation X, the baby boomers, Generation Y, and then whatever this recent crop is. I guess there'll be the we made America great again generation or something, but however that works. But what a horrible reputation that we so long later say, yeah, those were the grumblers. Those were the grumblers. That generation that was delivered. It's a terrible reputation. And I just want to pause for a moment and say, watch your own heart. We're so generous when we eulogize at funerals. And I'm not saying you need to be disrespectful, but I do think there's a temptation to be artificial also. And I would just exhort you that when someone has coffee afterwards, or when they're sitting down, they're really reflecting, and they've gotten over their weeping and their happy thoughts, that they don't recall, boy, that guy was a real jerk. And you'll have to examine your own hearts. Don't be that grumbling, unfaithful generation. Israel's grumbling was not simply a distasteful weakness of character, which it was, but a substantial problem of the heart that manifested itself in the challenging of leadership and a morbid evaluation of their past and present circumstances. So they're grumbling. This is a heart issue. It's not just, well, that's just how Israel is. The Irish, they fight. The Israelites, they grumble. No, it's not. And, and I'm sure there's something to Irish temperament that, I don't know, it may be a blood pressure thing. I don't know, but...
No, it's not. It's just our temperament.
Okay, well, there you go. But this is a heart issue. It's not, that's just how they are. Boy, we give a lot of comforting buffer for ourselves and others in that regard. Well, that's just how they are. Yeah, it is. And it's because there's that old man that needs to be mortified. And until they're fully mortified, that's going to, I guess, be how they are. They need to deal with that. And it manifests itself in challenging leadership. And we just alluded to, that's no small thing. And I know it sounds very self-serving to say, well, isn't it convenient for a pastor in the church to say not to challenge leadership? But I want you to think about things like, how about let's just lend ourselves to King David for a moment and how he talked about Saul. He never was like, yeah, Saul, he slayed his thousands, me my 10,000. I can take him. His armor was big for a while, but it ain't so big now. It was, this is the Lord's anointed. Messenger runs to him. Saul's dead. How do you know? Well, he was in a bad spot. He was going to die. He didn't want them to kill him. He had me run him through. Oh, okay. This guy's, go ahead and kill him now. Don't touch the Lord's anointed. Now, we're not anointed kings. We're not anointed priests. I understand that. However, the Lord has his people. And if the church is affirmed and we set aside those that we've recognized, this is who the Lord's given us to lead, to care, to direct, then let's watch our hearts. Let's be careful. It manifests itself in different ways. Also, a morbid evaluation of their past and present circumstances. What happened in 1 through 3? You've got to know. I just told you. 21, 1-3, what happened?
Military victory.
Yeah, military victory. And it was a supernatural one too, right? In the sense that our generals, I don't know, maybe people pray, but I don't think they make vows and then honor those vows. This was a unique military victory. And then we'll later see in the context that they say this food that we have is just garbage. And what is that food that they have?
Manna.
Yeah. How many of y'all had manna this morning? And there was dew out and no manna. You woke up too late. It melted. The Lord supernaturally is providing for his people. What about water? Like, I'm apparently needing water today, but it's not bitter, it's not poisonous, and I didn't have to, it's pretty easy to come by. What about them? Did they have water? By what means? Yeah, the water's bitter, well, the Lord makes it sweet. It's not there, strike the rock. It's not there, speak to the rock. Struck it anyway. Okay, Moses, Aaron, you're out now. Because they failed to treat the Lord as holy, and that's no small deal. But he provided and provided, and yet they were so ungrateful. Now I want to quickly highlight portions from the many grumbling passages. Now I'll have to move quickly here. I give a fuller treatment of them in the study guide, but I want you to see this pattern, and I want you to pay attention to the following elements. Grumbling betrayed the failure of the people's hearts. Grumbling betrayed the strength of the people's leadership, and most importantly, grumbling betrayed the majestic character of God. It basically said, what you have done is insufficient, it is dissatisfying. And so then that trickled down to, I can't get to God, so I'm going to go after his man. And so here we have this rather terrible layout, this character study of this beloved people. I'll highlight just a few things as we go. Actually, I'll only address the highlight of the underlined and italicized for time. So here, Exodus 14. Was it because there's no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away in the wilderness? It'd be better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness. Boy, did you forget Exodus 2? That they were groaning 400 years? Did you just take us out here to die? It would have been better to have died there. And then the italicized parts I have are the challenge to the leadership. You've taken us away to die. What have you done to us? God's man doing God's work. The people grumbled against Moses, saying, what shall we drink? Moses, it's on you to provide this water out of nowhere. If I can't get to God, I'm going to go after Moses. Exodus 16. They grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. Would that we have died in the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt. When we sat by meat pots and ate bread to the full, for you've brought us out into the wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. Oh, you finally figured Moses out. I hate my people, and I've come out, I've duped the Lord Almighty to bring you out here to murder you by hunger. What foolishness. Moses finally having enough. Therefore the people quarreled with Moses and said, give us water to drink. And Moses said to them, why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord? But the people thirsted there for water, and the people grumbled against Moses. Again, can't get to the Lord. Go after his man. Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst? Numbers 11:1. The people complained in the hearing of the Lord about their misfortunes, and when the Lord heard it, his anger was kindled, and the fire of the Lord burned against them and consumed outlying parts of the camp. It's not just, boy, I wish they'd stop that. This is sin, and sin has consequences. Numbers 11:4-6. The people go on, oh, that we had meat to eat. We remember the fish we ate in Egypt that cost nothing, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic. But now our strength has died up, and there's nothing at all but this manna to look at. Wow. Boy, Lord, I loved when I was in my hopeless disposition, and then because, my sin was so satisfying. I mean, that's us, right? Like, Lord, you've given me them and this body here. I used to, I didn't have to wake up on Sunday mornings. I actually always did because my parents took me to church, thankfully. But this taste for sin, and then the fact that how unbelievably disrespectful. How many of you had to clean your plates growing up? You should have, even if you didn't have to. And part of that is, obviously, it can be a stewardship issue, but it's a respect thing. It's a, somebody's worked hard at this. Well, the Lord, supernaturally, this is what I'm going to do for my beloved and my people of covenant promise. Of all the peoples, not because they're magnificent or big or great, but because I set my affection on their fathers, they're hungry. I'm going to give them manna. And I'm going to teach them also, as Deuteronomy will later say, that you're going to learn that man shall not live by bread alone, but by the word, every word from God. And, Jesus thought that was important. He quoted it himself in a like context. Numbers 11:11. Moses said to the Lord, why have you dealt ill with your servant? And isn't this is such a grieving situation. Moses is praying. It's not just that they're grumbling against him. This is taxing him. This is a man set apart, not all that particularly willfully initially, zealous for his people, but they've burdened him so much. Why have I not found favor in your sight that you lay this burden of all this people on me? He continues, verse 14. I am not able to carry all this people alone. The burden is too heavy for me. Shame on them. This is God's man, and they've burdened him to the point where he's, Lord, why have you done this to me? I didn't birth this people, and yet you've done this. You have wept in the hearing of the Lord, Moses states to the people, who will give us meat to eat? For it was better for us in Egypt. And then they're going to get meat. They're going to get a lot of meat. And it's going to be coming out their noses. And in judgment, they'll suffer. Verse 20. You have wept before me, saying, why did we come out of Egypt? It's the nations that say, we saw what happened in Egypt, and we feared the magnificence of the glory of God. And yet the people that were the beneficiaries of it are saying, why? Are you picking up on the theme yet? Better in Egypt, better in Egypt, better in Egypt, better in Egypt. Oh, here we go again, Numbers 14. And all the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The whole congregation said to them, would that we had died in the land of Egypt, or would that we had died in this wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us into this land to fall by the sword? So now they're on the precipice of taking the promised land. You have the bad spy reports, and they're saying, oh, that we had died in Egypt, or at least we died in the wilderness, but now we're going to die in our promised land. Our wives and our little ones will become a prey. Would it not be better for us to go back to Egypt? And they said to one another, let us choose a leader and go back to Egypt. Whoa, that's horrific and terrifying. 14:11, there's going to be several in 14. That was a very consequential passage, and we'll soon be to our passage. And the Lord said to Moses, how long will this people despise me? And how long will they not believe in me in spite of all the signs that I have done among them? 14:19, please pardon. So isn't this amazing? You've burdened this man almost to the point of being broken. And the people are under severe judgment now. And then what does the man Moses do? Please pardon the iniquity of this people according to the greatness of your steadfast love, just as you have forgiven this people from Egypt until now. Boy, that's a man you can follow, right? That when you have broken him, what does he do? Lord, would you forgive them? Would you please have mercy on them? And he petitions the character of God, which he knew. And how did he know it? Lord, show me your glory. And the Lord shows him his character. Steadfast love and abundant mercy. 14:21-23. But truly as I live and as all the earth shall be filled. This is why there's going to be wondering. All the earth shall be filled with the glory of the Lord. None of the men who have seen my glory and my signs that I did in Egypt and the wilderness, and yet have put me to the test these 10 times, and have not obeyed my voice, shall see the land that I swore to give to their fathers, and none of those who despised me shall see it. That's why that generation was going to die. 14:26-31. This is where he's laying out that they're going to wander in the wilderness and die. I'll just highlight the first couple of things. How long shall this wicked congregation grumble against me? The Lord's speaking there. He knows that this is against him. This is not Moses here. I've heard the grumblings of the people of Israel, and they grumble against me. Say to them, but wait a second here. I've heard what? The grumblings. Exodus 2, I heard what? Boy, wait. I've heard their groaning, and now I've heard their grumbling. 16:9-13. just going to skip down to the end for efficiency. You have brought us out of the land flowing with milk and honey to kill us in the wilderness, that you must also make yourself a prince over us. Wow. 16:41 to 42. You've killed the. Okay. So this is Korah's rebellion, post-Korah's rebellion. They've already rebelled. The Lord. So this is the context here. Moses says, if this is of me, these men won't die a natural death. They'll die unlike other people. Nobody's died yet. And then boom, what happens? The earth opens up, swallows them up, closes back up. Korah's rebellion squashed, done. And then the people see that, and then what do? But on the next day, all the congregation of the people of Israel grumble against Moses and against Aaron, saying, you have killed the people of the Lord. And when the congregation had assembled against Moses and against Aaron, they turned toward the tent of meeting, and behold, the cloud covered it, and the glory of the Lord appeared. The Lord had his man's back in this sense. 17:5, Aaron's identified indisputably as the priest, so that the grumbling can stop. Numbers 22-5. It just again continues. They assembled themselves against Moses and against Aaron. The people quarreled with Moses. Would that we had perished. Made us come up out of the land of Egypt to bring us to this evil place. 20 verse 11 to 13. It finishes with the people of Israel quarreled with the Lord, and through them he showed himself holy, the Lord. So here we have grumbling betrayed the failure of the people's hearts. Grumbling betrayed the strength of the people's leadership, and grumbling, most importantly, betrayed the majestic character of God. Because we have to be honest with ourselves and examine our hearts and recognize what's really the issue here. Am I mad at this, or am I dissatisfied with the Lord? Am I angry with this, or is it that I and my sinfulness have such an unsatisfied appetite for what I want and not what the Lord would have? So it's against both the natural leadership and against God. And again, you have to examine your heart. The aim was God, not Moses. And we saw that. We saw that alluded to, but then every so often it was more plain. And this is not to say that there's never a time to address grievances with leadership. I'm not trying to insulate the leadership. I'm not trying to say, well, look, if you got a problem with me, it's really a problem with God. No, I run over frequently, and that's not God's problem. That's mine, okay? I may not be as polite to you as I should, because I tend to get tunnel vision, and I might not say hello, and that's not a problem with God. I just need to look up and be polite. But if we in all humility are pleading with the Lord, how can we shepherd and care for this people, and you resist and you buck up against it, then we have a problem. So we need to examine ourselves and be careful. Just be careful. This is not a gripe lesson. It's a shepherding context and view of these things. Now, 21:4. We got to our first verse, and this is important. Again, the context, as we established, the Lord supplied their victory yet once again. We've already talked about 21 verses 1 to 3, how the Lord magnificently delivered them. They destroyed that city. They paid their vows, but they're nevertheless, again, returning to that grumbling. Now, it's, again, likely, if not probable, that the route that they took that we saw here, I think it was a contributing factor to their impatience. There's details that are provided in Scripture that are always necessary, and in the immediate context of they became impatient, what's preceding it is they're going from Mount Hor around Edom down to the Red Sea, which I can't say this definitively. I personally tend to think, boy, if I thought I was going back toward the Red Sea, what am I going to be thinking? This is where this all started. We're right up here where all the unfortunate incidents happen. We've been wandering around. People have been dying. We're heading down to the Red Sea, and we can't even go through Edom? Good grief! But it's not excusable. As you'll remember, Israel, again, was not granted access to through Edom, so they have to take that roundabout route. So their path from Mount Hor was less direct, and it was less favorable territory. It wasn't even a particularly favorable area. Kyle and Dolch state the following, quote, on the whole, it was a horrible desert where they had to travel down, with a loose sandy soil and drifts of granite and other stones, where terrible sandstorms sometimes arise from the neighborhood of the Red Sea. It was rough. It was rough, but was the Lord being faithful? Yes. I don't think it's proper to diminish. There was genuine hardships there. It was hard. I don't think anybody walked to church today, did you? What happens when anybody ever run out of gas or had a flat tire actually had to walk before? Like one foot in front of the other stuff? We get inconvenienced, and it's like that will probably be what we talk about for a week, or next time we see somebody, boy, you never know, I had to walk like 2 miles to whatever. They're going so far out of their way. And I'm sure it was taxing them. And it was a difficult area, and I don't want to diminish that, but you also cannot diminish that the Lord of glory, the covenant-keeping God with his beloved and set-apart people, was taking care of them. So don't misprioritize. Let's balance the tension of what they were going through, but what they really had. So the challenges were primarily for 2 reasons for them. First, almost 40 years before the nation failed to exercise proper faith, they rebelled to 40 years of that led to 40 years of wandering. That's a real context of struggle. And that was part of the struggle, and it was their own doing. Their own doing. We recognize that, right? Their own doing. The second element or reason that it was particularly hard was a measure of providence, a larger providence. Was it their fault that the Lord had said, don't go into Edom? No, that was a larger providence, right? Jacob had 2 sons, Isaac had 2 sons, right? 1 son of promise. The boys, Old Testament boys will be Old Testament boys. They did some goofy stuff. But that doesn't mean the Lord wasn't faithful. But there was the we're at fault context, and there was just providence. The we're at fault's going to mean a little bit of a rough ride. The we're not at fault means we're going to go even further around. That's not their problem. That's not their fault, not their problem. But that does mean that that the Lord would be faithful to his other promises and to Edom in that regard. So we've laid the passage's foundation, and I want us to press on to think through this matter for ourselves as well. I want you to think through this. We too endure various challenges, right? Sometimes we inflate them, but we do genuinely struggle at times, right? Some of them by our own making. We sin, we do wrong, we got to take our licks, right? Sometimes that's a lifetime of taking licks. Some on the account of a larger providence that we may not understand, may or may not understand. And that's just part of it. There are situations where you have to, faithful pastoral counseling doesn't say, well, I don't know, God just didn't have this, or God wants better for you. Sometimes you have to look at somebody and say, you may just have a life of suffering, and that may be your story for the rest of your life, and you're going to have to demonstrate faithfulness. And the Lord will be faithful in that process. And that's hard, okay? That's hard. That's not just medical, that's also just life sometimes. Some of y'all, I know your family context. Boy, you might just have a hard context. And I'm sorry. And that doesn't mean the Lord's not faithful. The danger and potential tragedy is when we fail to discipline our hearts amidst struggle, and instead, when we feed an improper attitude that will inevitably produce foolish grumbling and displeasing conduct. It's when we don't say, wow, Lord, you're reflecting your love toward us by your disciplining us, right? When instead you buck up against it and say, well, why? Well, why? It's because you offended the Lord of glory. And it should be more why serpents aren't coming from everywhere and biting you, or why the earth hasn't opened up, or the fire hasn't come down. The why is those whom the Lord loves, he disciplines. And thank the Lord he does. And it also might be, again, I didn't ask for this. I didn't ask for this context. Like, if you'll forgive me, you didn't ask to have like Mormon family members, right? That's hard. Who else has Mormon family here, by the way? So we don't know that struggle, do we? And that is hard. But should he go about and say, well, the Lord doesn't, he's insufficient, he doesn't care. Or is it, Lord, I don't know, you're going to be pleased to use me? Are you going to be pleased to use me in my circumstances? Hard things at work. How many of you work in any capacity? There's, how many of you have ever had a struggle with administration, oversight, or otherwise? Wow, what a magnificent opportunity to not grumble. But boy, we want to, but in terms of providence, that's who the Lord's put over us, and we'll trust him with that. And then, the fact of the matter is, because we've grumbled, we'll repent. This tragedy is compounded in that it spoils an honest perspective and strips away the gratitude that we would otherwise freely express. I want you to look at Israel and scratch your head and then say, boy, why did they get it so wrong, and why do I too? Because the fact of the matter is, we were born into sin, and until the Lord finishes his work, we're going to fight this, right? And they saw, and you might say that's how foolish and ignorant they were to see and still not believe, but that's not the issue. The issue is, what does Jesus say when people ask him for a sign? Well, so I'll give you the sign. I'll give you Jonah, which, that's an important reason to say Jonah, isn't it? No, it's also, signs aren't going to be what persuades you. And even think about one of the most radical signs at the end of Jesus' earthly ministry, when he raises Lazarus from the dead. And what was the response to the religious leadership? It wasn't, whew, that's weird. It wasn't falling on their faces. Does anybody remember their response?
They wanted to kill Lazarus.
Yeah, we have to get rid of the evidence. It's getting rid of the body, but the body ain't dead. And that's, it's because their hearts were so hardened. So don't think that this has changed. The only thing that's changed is that you understood what Jesus will allude to later in John chapter 3 when he tells Nicodemus, unless you're born again, you won't see the kingdom of heaven. That's our advantage, okay? Is that hopefully, you can say, yes, I affirm that you will not see the kingdom of heaven unless you've been born again, and thanks be to God, I've been born again, and that because the Lord, just as Moses raised the serpent, so the Son of Man was raised up, and I believed. I didn't have to look to believe that that'll cure my snake bite. I looked and believed on the Son of Man who was risen and who was raised up on the cross and later ultimately raised up in ascension at the right hand of the Father. So we're at a positional advantage. But don't you dare fail to search your hearts. We're going to go more and more into next week with verses 5 through 9 and unpack it further. But there's a context, and I wanted us to appreciate the context. And again, just self-examine. We need the Lord's help. And I think if we're going to do anything, we're going to grumble. I mean, really. That's our go-to. And it's really unfortunate because it is a reflection of our heart.